Well, like everyone else, I'm honored to be here. My wife Kathleen joins us. She was the recent Democratic Party chairman of Maryland, so we have another Politico here. The cause of democracy is probably my main concern. I'm not quite as dramatic as our previous speaker. I don't think anybody is as dramatic as that. But I do have a lot of concern about where we are right now, and I want to bring them to Jim Comey. I want to ask you just in generally, I think we've had political figures in our history that have a sense of the American nervous system. I think Nixon, whatever you say about him, he had a sense of the 50s and what we worried about with communism and just the whole mental state of the country. He really knew it, and he could work with it. And I wonder whether Trump has ability to do that too, to work the squirrely part of our minds, the worried part of our minds. And he connect with it in a way that Hillary Clinton and a lot of regular politicians have no idea how to do it, that he can do it. And I think he's doing it right now. Hostages. Hostages. The same word we've been used to with Hamas and what's going on in Gaza. The very word right on the tip of our tongues, he said. So he grabbed that word, the J6, hostages. And he even says, some people call them prisoners. I call them hostages. He wants this fight. What do we do about that?
Well, first, thanks for having us for this conversation. I really look forward to it. I guess I should start by saying Donald Trump and I weren't that close, so I'm not that good. I'm not sure he's that good at understanding what's in his mind, but I think he's doing something that the prior panel talked about. It's not too dramatic to say we're seeing a lost cause type effort to rewrite, to normalize shocking and horrible behavior. And this is part of it, to use words to relabel, to put up statues in honor of our Confederate heroes, except Jim Longstreet, who betrayed the lost cause. And so that's part of what's going on. But I want to start, though, Chris, by saying I want to be clear-eyed about the threat that January 6th represents, but I also don't want to overstate it. I think there's a risk, and it's a product of my own experience, that those of us in the security business, when something horrible happens, especially if it was in part the product of a security failure, there's a danger that we will overstate the threat. And I actually think, and I was part of this, so this is about me, that September the 11th was a horrible event, but it was in large measure a security failure of our imagination and our preparation. And a group of terrorists got extraordinarily, I hate to use the word lucky, but lucky, and brought down buildings they never imagined they could bring down. And we responded to that by, in part, making al-Qaeda an existential threat in our minds to the United States. And I think that led us to do things at home and abroad that were mistakes. And so I hope we're not going to repeat any of those mistakes about January 6th, because it was in the main a security failure.
Yeah.
Right? It was a threat that moved at the speed of daylight walking. And I still don't know the answer to how that hill was not adequately defended against that threat. But had it been adequately defended, it never would have happened. And as a security professional, that was what was in part so weird about that day. I was shocked by the activity, but I was shocked by the lack of preparation. And so what I don't want to do is respond to that by saying there's a boogeyman under the bed. It's Trumpist violence, because that's going to be used against us. We're already hearing it. We can't hold Trump accountable in the criminal courts because of the violence that might bring. We can't hold him accountable under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment because of the violence that will bring. I think there's a lot of effort on the right to overstate that threat.
Yeah.
And so I separate threats and threat. We are experiencing an epidemic of threats aimed at good public servants. As someone who's received a lot of threats, they're terrifying, they unsettle your families, they're really bad, and there are those who act on those threats. But when I stare at the threat, capital T, I'm not sure it's that significant. Where were they when Donald Trump was arraigned in Manhattan, in Atlanta, in Florida, in D.C.? Where were those who were going to overrun us with violence? I think they're home because we scared the shit out of them with the prosecutions of January 6th.
Well, let me. I have a little method I do. I always say, suppose they got away with it. With Nixon and Watergate, suppose they got away with it. Here, suppose the Metropolitan Police didn't arrive. It was just, I was a Capitol cop. I know what power they have. They were all individually, they were good people and they're doing the best they could, but they couldn't keep the doors closed. And the Metropolitan Police arrived an hour or two later and they saved the day. But suppose they hadn't arrived. Suppose they got a hold of the vice president. They got a hold of Pelosi, the Speaker of the House. Where do you think it was going?
I don't know. There were those in the crowd who were acting with organization and specific seditious intent, Oath Keepers, Proud Boys. And there were a whole lot of others who were morons who believed the lies of Donald Trump. And so how that would play out, I don't know. It would have been awful in all kinds of ways.
Remember the guy, there was an African-American guy. He was leading them in the wrong direction so they wouldn't go chasing after, I think, Mitt Romney. And so there were really efforts to decoy them and to misdirect them so they could save the lives of these members who knew their lives were threatened.
Yeah, and by the way, this is very personal for me. My son was one of the first responders, a SWAT officer who stood on the steps facing the Washington Monument, got hit in the neck with something thrown from the crowd. And so this is personal. There were heroic actions by the first responders on site. I don't mean to take anything away from them when I say, had there been 2,000 officers deployed to protect the Hill, it would have been protected. I'm not trying to take anything away from the Goodmans and the others who sacrificed so much that day. But I don't want it to lead us into overstating the threat. There's a significant threat, but I don't want to repeat history and imagine an existential threat. We've had political violence in this country, but I don't think we are on the cusp of that kind of violence. We face something that you and I are going to talk about that we have to continue to address, but it's not the existential threat, we can't hold Donald Trump accountable because we're afraid of the violence.
Well, we've always wondered about whenever there's an act of violence, whether it's 9/11 and who's cheering for it as opposed to opposing it. Some people cheering when we don't like them to cheer. The Irish always wonder how many of them are supporting the IRA and how many weren't supporting it. Today, they're not supporting it. And I think you wonder about whether the people are secretly saying, well, I'll vote. I'm going to vote that way. I'm going to vote for those people. I'm going to vote for all the people that fought at the Capitol. In my family, I know it in Pennsylvania. I know there's a reality out there to it. My brother says, me and all my friends are voting for Trump. And I go, is that because of what they saw, the elite cracking down on the regular people? I mean, you don't think there's a wave out there?
No, I think there is an audience that is susceptible to the language of violence, the encouragement to violence. It's also an audience that is, as against a lot of the threats that I worked, and my former deputy Andy McCabe is here and is an expert in ways that I'm not, the threats we worked were less deterrable because you were talking about a threat involving people who wanted to go to a reward in paradise, willing to lay down their lives because of this enemy they saw. That's not this audience, which makes this audience deterrable. And so I wasn't being facetious. I think what has happened is that the 1,200 prosecutions out of January the 6th, I know this because I've talked to people who are still doing the work, has sent a shockwave of deterrence through that audience. These are, in the main, people with jobs, people with roots in the communities you talked about. They can be frightened, and that's what deterrence is. And so that wave of deterrence works against the rhetoric that we have to stand up and fight. We have to fight. Against that comes, we will ruin your lives if you fight. I think the accountability that's represented in the 1,200 is essential. Every single person who committed an offense on Capitol Hill that day must be held accountable so that the message is, never again, don't you dare. Protest, shout, march, but don't you dare try and interfere in the constitutional process of this country or we will ruin you. That's why those cases are so important. I don't think that most of those people have been prosecuted would offend again. It's not about that. General deterrence. Don't you dare, any of you. We have always had a stew, a radioactive stew in the basement of America.
Yeah.
It's misogynistic, it's racist, there's violence there in America's basement. It's just part of who we are. But we control it in two different ways. We control it by building a building of law around it that says, you come out of these doors, we're going to lock your butt up. But we also put control rods that are cultural down into the radioactive stew. And what's been happening in this country is, over the last 7, 8 years, is the control rods are being withdrawn by people like Donald Trump and his enablers. Yeah. And radiation is banging around inside the building. The building of law has done a really good job of containing it and sending a message. But it's not enough. The reason a gathering like this is so important and the meetings you all talked about are so important is we need to send a message that we have to push the control rods back down in. It's not okay to talk about violence. It's not okay for one of our two parties, the Republicans, to be embracing the idea that January 6th was a heroic event. It's not okay. They're trying to pull the control rods out. We must push it deeper and deeper into the stew.
Trump's out there saying, and I'll just use the Trump because his behavior, I want to focus on more than what he is or what he's been doing. I think about the guy just picked up in Florida, a guy named Shapiro down there. He's just been arrested for threatening Swalwell's wife, the congressman from California. You had the case of a Utah guy, a federal agent killed him because he was threatening the life of the president. You say that, and you have camera work. I mean, all these people, the 700 people that have confessed to their crimes of January 6th, you've got them on camera, right? So you can prove that, hey, I got your picture there, buddy. You're going to jail. In fact, there's 20 or so cases. These are felony cases. You actually have the evidence against them. That hasn't shut up Donald Trump. He's out there making a joke about Paul Pelosi getting hit on the head with a hammer in a life-threatening situation and say, where's Nancy? He's actually making a joke right now about a criminal assault in the middle of the night in San Francisco. He's laughing at it. He's personally laughing at law enforcement.
Again, I don't know his mind, but he is laughing in some ways. He's terrified in others because the great shining stress test success of America in the last 4 years has been the rule of law. The courts have held, the culture of our legal profession has held. You can say whatever you want with mascara running down your face in front of Four Seasons Total Landscaping, but if you come into an American courtroom and you lie, as a litigant or an attorney, there will be severe consequences. That message has been sent across by Republicans.
So the $300 million lawsuit against Rudy Giuliani is having an effect.
Oh, it matters. It matters. The pleas from the attorneys in Atlanta matter. The cases matter. This is us as a society imposing accountability. So Donald Trump may laugh on the outside, but accountability is coming for him. My hope is that we don't allow the boogeyman under the bed to scare us into backing off that accountability. No, no, no. There must be accountability. The threat is significant. I'm sure we're going to talk about what it means to be threatened as an official. But we shouldn't imagine this monster that keeps us from doing what we have to do to be a healthy democracy.
So the only one suing the court right now, going to the Supreme Court, is Donald Trump. He's looking for immunity. But the average person doesn't have immunity who engages in this kind of behavior. He can launch an attack on the Capitol and be immune to prosecution because he evaded conviction by the U.S. Senate.
Well, let's see how that turns out. I mean, that is, the rule of law is in progress. In fact, this morning, I'm sure some of you might have been caught in traffic, where they were arguing in front of the D.C. Circuit that very question, and it'll be resolved. I'm optimistic as to how it'll be resolved, that as the district court said, we don't have a divine right of kings in the United States. And I'm reasonably confident the court's not going to find that an impeachment and acquittal operates as a double jeopardy bar. So there is going to be accountability. There's also going to be a lot of challenge for local officials dealing with these threats. As I said, I meant it. There's an epidemic of threats, and please don't hear me to say that's not significant. It's really important that law enforcement hold those people who are in the main keyboard cowboys accountable. It's very important that they hold accountable the disturbed few who will act on those threats, but those should not stop us from doing what we have to do.
Just in terms of practice, how do you distinguish between the wacko that calls up and says, I can't stand Nancy Pelosi and I'm going to do something about it, and doesn't do anything about it, and the guy that is a danger?
Well, you identify the person and then do an assessment of their life. Talk to their neighbors, their friends, find out what their roots are in the community, what their mental health history is, all of those things that you use in every case to assess a subject, and then hold them accountable regardless, because it doesn't matter whether you plan on acting on it. If you threaten someone, this case is being brought all over the country by U.S. attorneys using this interstate threat statute. Hold them accountable, and the degree of the punishment will be driven by the characteristics of the person. Most of them, again, are these keyboard cowboys. There are dangerous people out there.
What's a keyboard cowboy?
Just someone who's heroic only when they're sitting behind the keyboard.
Yeah, I think about journalists sometimes that way. Op-ed writers. Anyway, here's a Brookings Institution poll of the public. It said, quote, "Because things have gotten so far off, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country." Now, this to me sounds like 7 Days in May kind of stuff. Some general decides he's going to knock off the president. A quarter of the country agree with that statement. A third of Republicans do, and 40% of Trump supporters. So you're talking about counter-influencing people like this. Isn't it mainstreaming, becoming more mainstream for people to actually say things like that, at least to pollsters? They're telling pollsters, yeah, I think I can get the violence.
Yeah, because people like Donald Trump and Congresswoman Stefanik and lots of others have created a permission structure for people to talk that way. And it matters. That's the control rods coming out. You can make a difference if we have a concerted effort to press a cultural control rod in. Maybe the most significant example in my life is when I was a kid, George Carlin had a routine about the 7 dirty words you couldn't say on television. And one of them was the F word. I'm not going to say it now because who knows, but I can say that freely. One of the most remarkable and cool things that's happened in my life is that's not the greatest epithet in America today. The greatest epithet in America today is a race-based word that begins with N. Yeah. It cannot be said publicly. That is amazing and wonderful. That's a cultural change. There are still lots of racists in this country, but they can't talk that way because it's not culturally acceptable. It's been driven down. We need a similar effort to push the control rods in, so it's not okay to talk about violence. It's not okay to talk about watering the tree of liberty with the blood of tyrants and patriots. It's not okay. That's not about the FBI's job, the prosecutor's job. That's about the jobs of the rest of us to push the control rods into the stew.
Let's talk about the FBI. A quarter of the country has told the Washington Post pollsters that they suspect or have solid evidence, that's their term, solid evidence that the FBI organized January 6th. They got solid evidence out there. So what do you do when the law enforcement, the good guys, are portrayed as the bad guys by a significant portion of the country?
First of all, I really like the framing that I think Donna gave us, that we should instead think 75% of Americans are not wingnuts. Yeah. So that's a great way to think about it. That there's only so much you can do.
But that's your 75%.
Right.
They're the good guys.
But look, I guess to be funny about it, because I don't know what the percentages are of those who think the FBI is holding in its basement evidence of aliens landing on the earth, that the FBI has secrets about the Kennedy assassination we haven't revealed. So that number in the main doesn't surprise me or depress me. It doesn't.
What does that number tell you? Is it just American wariness, suspicion of all authority? Is it Butch Cassidy stuff? We're the outlaw. I mean, what is that thing that says, I do mistrust everybody? I do mistrust the Warren Commission. I mistrust Bobby Kennedy. Was he really killed by Sirhan? Well, we saw it, but, I don't know. I mean, what is that?
I think there's meaning in conspiracies. I think people, by imagining there isn't a secret authority that's out there that runs things in an odd way. I'm not an expert on this, but I think experts would tell you that's consoling to people. It imposes a sense of order on a world to their eyes otherwise lacks order. It's all being controlled by the Illuminati or something. So I think the human brain is naturally drawn to these things, especially the American brain.
Yeah.
So it doesn't depress me, but it's very important for the FBI to continue to interact with the American public and talk about the work, show the work. I found it, I'm trying to pick a neutral word, I found it very disappointing that there was no word from the FBI or the Department of Justice for 3 days after the execution of a court-ordered search warrant at Mar-a-Lago. 3 days while lies were told to the American people that the American people, millions of them, internalized it. So that by the time Merrick Garland, who seems like a wonderful person, went to the podium and said, actually, we had a court order and here's how it works, it was too late. People had internalized that falsehood. Yeah. And so I know no one wants to, you may overlearn some of the lessons from my experience. Nobody wants to be out there in the public square talking about the work. You must be, because in your absence, a whole lot of lies are being told and they're not being countered, and they become part of the bloodstream of a lot of our country.
What's it mean to you that 7 of 10 Republicans say too much has been made of what happened on January 6th? I mean, we all saw the pictures. It's not some of us saw it, some of us didn't. No, we all saw the pictures over and over again. We know what happened, and yet 7 of 10 Republicans, that's half the country, don't think it was that big a deal.
They have to.
But they don't.
But no, I'm saying they have to approach it that way. Think about the choices they face. There's only 2. When they stare at those same images, they speak to them, and they say, you fool, look what you were part of. Look at what you were part of has done to America. So that's a decision branched right there. You can either then say, yeah, you're right, I was part of something really bad, I'm sorry, or you can try and rewrite it, push it into the corner, memory hole it. Donald Trump was right in his reptilian way that he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and get away with it because of the nature of people. Once I've attached my identity to him, every bad thing he does drags me deeper, because to get out, I have to admit, he shot someone on Fifth Avenue and I ignored that. He attacked the family of a Gold Star veteran. He talked about grabbing women by their genitals. Add it. And so now I'm going to walk away. How do I do that? What's the thing we do worst as humans? Admit when we're wrong, especially when it's about my identity. How do I admit that? I've prosecuted fraud cases where the victims came to the sentencing. The guy pled guilty. They came to the sentencing to speak for him because they could not acknowledge that they were wrong, and in a hugely important and embarrassing way. They couldn't say that about themselves, even after he did. That fog has trapped millions of Americans. So I totally get why 70 or 80.
So they're in for a dime, in for a dollar.
Yeah. I mean, again, I don't mean to be overdramatic. The lost cause analogy is apt. People who were involved in enslaving other human beings and killing to preserve that institution can either, when that's over, say, I did something deeply wrong and immoral, or rewrite it. Most humans are going to choose to rewrite it. There are some who have the courage to say, God, I'm ashamed of myself. I'm ashamed of what I did, but that's not human nature. And that's a part that Donald Trump gets. And he's out there now with the hostages, dragging them deeper and deeper. You couldn't get away from me when I did all those other things. You can't get away now. That's the unique hold of a demagogue.
Yeah, and also it's the challenge to someone like, who I do respect with a mixed effect, Mitch McConnell, who I know he loves the institution of the Senate, and yet he hasn't done anything.
Yeah, I don't want to comment on that.
Okay, well, I think because there are people that don't.
He used to come to my secure briefings and sit in front of me and fall dead asleep, so I don't know him either.
Well, he might hear that one. That might get out, that one. We talked, the woman from the leader of the Human Rights Campaign was here. It was so eloquent, obviously, and passionate. But, I've been going to those affairs for years, 20, 30 years ago, going to them. And I think a lot of it in American life is about change. And it's not about ideology. It's about your uncle at the Thanksgiving Day dinner, and he's got an old attitude about the sexual stuff and things like that. And he'll go, yeah, he'll give you an old attitude. You get them a little shot here and there. But that's part of life, and you sort of accept the fact that older people have a different view of things that are going on right now, right? The New York Times has points of view of the American people that a lot of American people aren't comfortable with. It's just a different point of view. It's a little hipper than they want to be. But here's a new one. Those who think America has changed for the worse since the 1950s. Now, that to me says a lot. The 1950s means pre-civil rights, pre-voting rights, pre-black activism, the whole opportunity to change the country. They liked it before it was changed, obviously. They liked Leave It to Beaver and, our gang comedy, for all I know. They want to go all the way back. But this is 3 out of 5 Democrats think the country's changed for the worse. 9 out of 10 Republicans. And 3 out of those 10 say they think it supports violence. In other words, they're so crotchety about change and what they're reading if they're reading any newspaper, the New York Times, or they're reading the New York Post, obviously, and that aggravates them. They're reading every day about a new country they don't like. How much of that part is feeding this Trumpian thing, this anti-democratic thing?
I think a big part of it is what earlier speakers talked about. The country has changed overwhelmingly for the better in my lifetime and your lifetime. The high water mark for white men may have passed us by, which is a very, very good thing.
I think we're talking about the Mad Men era.
Yeah, but I think two things are at work. First is a natural human tendency to say things suck today in a way they never have. When I talk to university audiences, I'm a depressing speaker, but I say to the kids, look, when I was a kid, this country was coming apart, literally. So I grew up in the 1960s. The president was murdered on television, and his brains were on his wife's pink dress. And then Dr. King was murdered. Malcolm X was murdered before that. That dead president's brother was murdered in a ballroom in California. Our cities were burning down. Thousands and thousands of American men were dying in Vietnam in a war we didn't understand. Thousands more were fleeing to Canada to get away from it. This country was coming apart. There were bombings. This sounds like an exaggeration. I don't mean it as an exaggeration. Every single day in the United States, in the period about 68 to 72, there was a bomb went off somewhere in the United States. But America didn't come apart because Lincoln liked to quote Seward saying, there's always enough virtue to save America. And then he paused and said, but just enough. So yeah, America has gone through difficult times. It's not true that America is worse today than long ago, but everybody likes to think that. To come back to the Trump thing, though, I think there's something else at work with a lot of those folks. Think about the amount of change that's happened, not just for white men in this country in our lifetimes, Chris. We've changed the way we think about faith, family, community, marriage, the role of women, so many other things. Everything has changed, and that's destabilizing for a lot of people. And I get why they are ripe picking for a demagogue. I had to go to Toronto for a business meeting, and I decided to drive and take one of my daughters because I wanted to drive her through central Pennsylvania. We drove through these little old mill towns of central Pennsylvania, and I said to her, look at these places. Washington is only 90 miles from here, but it seems like a world away. Yeah. These people feel left behind. They're angry, they're alone. Now, there's lots of reasons you could explain to them why they feel that way and why there's a countervailing tremendous goodness in America, but I get why they are ripe for the picking of a demagogue. And we have that person. We had that person as president. We have that person running for president again.
And you've got it coming up again in November, because where you're talking about is where I think his strength really lies. The rural areas of Pennsylvania, where it's 68% supported him last time. It'll be much higher this time. It's going to be much more tricky. You know, you talk about the violence of the country today, and some of it's imminent. Facebook group in 2017, there was a group called Terminate the Republican Party. And one of their characters went out to a Republican baseball practice session. We have it every year here, of course, between the two parties, and almost killed Steve Scalise. He's a good guy, I think. And then you have Paul Pelosi in the middle of the night being attacked by a guy with a hammer. You got Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who lives near our neighborhood in Chevy Chase. He's surrounded by, this isn't notorious trouble, but it's just people haranguing him. They don't like his judgment in a Dobbs case. You had this Utah guy who was just shot by federal agents who was threatening President Biden. And I mentioned that Florida guy who just got picked up on Friday, I think, for threatening the life of Eric Swalwell. You got round the clock, 24/7 bodyguards protecting Anthony Fauci. Why? So there's a sort of, what is the, are we living, and then I go back to something more historic, and I want to ask you about guns and American life. Of our presidents, I don't think Guatemala matches our record in what we do with our presidents. Lincoln was shot and killed, Garfield was shot and killed, McKinley was, John F. Kennedy was, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, all were facing life-threatening situations. Gerald Ford was shot at twice. Ronald Reagan was shot at, and the bullet was right near his heart. Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, John Lennon. This is a very dangerous country. It really is. And the idea that we're just looking at the latest rumors of war, no. We're a dangerous country with a lot of guns. And our leaders at the highest level have been shot at and killed. What's that about us? Not just recently. What's that about us as Americans and a willingness to resort to gunplay, to get even with people we don't like politically?
Well, first, it's a reminder that the threats have to be paid attention to. They may be, in the main, people who are never going to leave their basement, but there are disturbed people who will act on it and have easy access to a gun in America. So I don't want to be heard to say we shouldn't take it seriously. Those have to be worked. These things tend to move in fads, again, because it becomes part of the rhetoric of those who are listened to, and so people become attached to this idea that I ought to be threatening because there's lots of threats going on. What it says about us is we are a mixed up, wonderful, terrible, violent, amazing country. We've always had a baseline level of violence in America. We have more guns than people in America now, and they don't expire like yogurt. They're going to be there. Even if we stop selling guns today, we're going to have 360 million guns in this country 20 years from now. And so we are a complicated, difficult country. We have been since the beginning, and I don't have a great answer for that. But I think it's important that we not deny this reality.
Let's talk about what you were talking about, how law enforcement can penetrate into our culture and give people a sense of confidence. And I was thinking, I interviewed Brad Raffensperger. He's an amazing guy. You know, it's not a big deal being Secretary of State of a state. Most of us don't know who our Secretary of State is or ever will know. But he had Donald Trump on the phone with him, and Trump said, find me 12,000 votes. I mean, I don't know what it's like to have that experience, because they had hand counted the votes in Georgia. He knew his number. He had it to the vote, and he had to take the president on, practically locking arms with him. He had to take him on and say, no, you're wrong. How do we get secretaries of state and election workers like the two women who just won that big lawsuit? How do you get people the guts to say, you know, I can face this guy in court? I could be on the winning side of this thing. When all this noise about him leading the election right now in the battleground states, he's leading, I think, all of them, including Wisconsin. And you go, maybe he's going to win again. Maybe he's got 4 more years. Maybe he'll have the Attorney General working for him. Maybe the whole Justice Department will be working for him. Everybody's going to be working for him, including all the scaredy cats. They're all going to be working for him. How am I going to stand up to that now?
Through continuing to send messages of accountability. The rule of law is reassuring for good people and should be frightening for bad people. Anyone who thinks that it was a good career move to be one of Donald Trump's lawyers during the fall of 2020 has been disabused of that notion. There really is a deep culture of rule of law in the United States. Culture can be frustrating when you're trying to change it. It should be reassuring. Again, it doesn't matter whether judges are Republicans or Democrats or independents. There is a real thing that is bred into the lawyers and the entire legal system in this country. That lying is not acceptable, that we will hold people accountable, and that it happened and is ongoing should be comfort and reassurance, and also a little bit of deterrence to those going forward. Anybody tempted to monkey around in 2024 with vote counts or to do the things that people were asked to do in 2020 now has a living example of what happens to those people. You will be ruined. You will be incarcerated, maybe both of those things. That's a really important message to send. And we shouldn't be afraid to send it because it's part of who we are, that rule of law.
How do you advertise that right now? I mean, promulgate that, because I think we're in a state of squirreliness. I think everybody picks up the paper, they say, well, Biden's too old and Trump's randy as hell, he's gung-ho, he really is going to run for president again, he's really running again, he's killing his opponents, he's running at the 60% level against all opponents. None of them seems to have gotten any traction. He's going to win. Now, when he gets to court, he's got to get through the Supreme Court for immunity. He has to not having immunity. He will have to face justice. Do you have a sense that the wheels of justice in 2024 will be mobilized to act?
Yes.
Do you think we're going to have court trials this year?
Yes. The system is acting now. The great thing about especially federal judges, all judges, in the main, they don't give a crap about the conversation going on outside the courthouse. They are part of a culture. They have sworn to uphold the law. It will grind forward and do its job. And so people, I'm not sure there's a way to influence that, and that's, to my mind, that's a good thing. There will be trials this year. I don't know whether it will be the Jack Smith's case here in D.C. or the documents case in Florida. That one strikes me as the most straightforward. But I'm optimistic.
How about the RICO case, the one in Fulton County?
Hard for me to handicap it because I don't know that system well enough. There are things about that make me nervous. I'd rather see Donald Trump tried in the 2 federal cases because they're predictable, they're limited, they're focused in a really good way. You want to know what the evidence is that will be offered against Donald Trump in either of those cases? Read Jack Smith's indictments. He wrote what's called a speaking indictment. It's all there. It's like the indictment against Senator Menendez from New Jersey. It's all there. Read it. You'll see what the case will be. It's focused and it's devastating. And so those are the ones I would like to see go first.
Let's talk about the good guys. I want to talk mostly now about the good guys, and they're women. So all of them. I mean, Cassidy Hutchinson works for Mark Meadows. Her book's amazing. Liz Cheney's book, I'm going through it. She actually detailed what she saw. It's not like something as told to. She's seen it, and she describes what every moment of what happened in her experience going through the committee, the January 6th committee. The nerve of these people to actually get it all right, get it all on paper, get it published. And I just wonder, is this going to get to the public? This truth-telling. I keep thinking of Thomas More and how he had to stand up to Henry VIII. And whenever you think about it, the key story there is not just this wonderful man's truth to his religion, that I wished I'd honored my God as much as I had my Lord, but the fact is that this king could decree, like all the religions could do in the Middle Ages. They could say, I'm your prince, I'm your king, this is our religion. And you had to become a certain kind of Protestant, whatever, Calvinist, whatever it was, or a Church of England, because the king said so. He just said, I am king, I am head of the Church of England, obey me. And they all said yes, because they're all scared for their lives. They're going to be beheaded. And I look at the way Trump behaves today. If he hadn't said, I won the election, all these people out there wouldn't be saying he won the election. Stefanik wouldn't be saying it. She wouldn't be mimicking every word he speaks. This is kingly-like behavior. He states a fact, and people all say, yes, that's true. They wouldn't have said in the mob that he won the election. The mob wouldn't have said he won the election. He did.
Yeah,
and they all mimic him to the point where these people are grown-up people. They have the power to vote. They are true citizens of the United States, and they mimic his voice. And that's what's frightening about the threat to democracy we're talking about here, that a king can simply speak as a king and will be obeyed. It's frightening.
Yes, it's also revealing of character. I said that legal systems had a stress test. The character of individuals has been subject to that same stress test. I mean, was sitting next to Alex Vindman. I mentioned Andy McCabe. Those are people for whom the stress revealed character. There are millions of people like that, and then there's those who are not. That's just the nature of humans. It's going to be really important going forward that we not allow those people to write their own personal lost cause life story, because just as Joe McCarthy disappeared after 4 years and suddenly no one had been involved, no one supported him, I wasn't there, there's going to be a lot of that's going to go on when Donald Trump is finally cleansed from the American system. Forget the ordinary people who are caught in the fog of lies. They will find their way out. It's going to be important to hold accountable those whose character was revealed by the stress test.
So here we go, heading forward to the summer of, I'm sorry, this happens.
Mitch McConnell here.
No, it's Morning Joe, which is good. That's good news. Let's talk about this summer. You know, I think about, didn't the Democrats, and that's nobody's fault really, but the Democrats are going back to Chicago. I mean, it's hard to believe when all that happened there in 1968, one of the most, I didn't miss a minute of television that week. I watched every minute of it, but it was all sort of a celebration of hell. It was a terrible thing. We all wish Bobby Kennedy was there at that time. He never got to be there. He couldn't. There's nobody carrying the anti-war cause. But back to Chicago will certainly wake up things. We've got these people with bodyguards. Everybody's getting assigned to bodyguards. I know members of Congress that you can't believe are getting bodyguards. They have to pay for them themselves in some cases. Everybody's getting bodyguarded. Is that part of the solution? The candidate's speech is that, you know, every time Joe Biden gets out to give a speech, I'm sure there's worry.
It has to be, before we move off the bodyguards, it has to be part of the solution in the short run, because there are, among the threats, there will be real, serious threats that disturbed people will act on. But at the same time, we have to figure out a way to address the threat in that way, but not let it dominate us, not let it occupy the space in our heads that it wants to occupy. Most people making threats want to have an effect on those receiving the threat. They want you to worry about them all the time.
What's it called now?
They want you to change.
Swatting or something?
Swatting is when you call and report an emergency that might lead to a SWAT team responding. You want to rent space in that person's head. And so somehow, and I've had more practice at this than most, is that you have to acknowledge the threat, take it seriously, but not give it the space that the threatener wants it to have, not let it affect your family, your sporting activities in a meaningful way. And there's a way to balance those things, but there's a short-term cost, which is you have to have front of mind protecting yourself and your family.
When do you think, we talked about, many of the speakers this morning on the panel were very good on it, this idea of polarization, and has it come to a new fever pitch? I've wrestled with it. I think it's a dynamic. I think it has to do with, to some extent, the Vietnam War, which really did drive sons against fathers and fathers against sons. That was really in the family, that war. It was in my life. And I think in many people's lives, it was a family fight over the war. And then, of course, some people ran against the anti-war people rather than for the war, which was a clever political thing to do. Just go against the long hairs and whatever, and then you'd be a popular figure. But they didn't really defend the war. They just attacked the anti-war people. But that was my culture. And then, of course, came Watergate, which a lot of Republicans, I do believe it, and may be right, that it was overkill. Okay, he did some bad things, but let's not make this whole thing about they're corrupt, we're not corrupt. And then it spiraled into the 80s, and I was in Democratic cloakrooms when I would see the ferociousness of people. They weren't all left-wingers either. They just got ferocious about the partisan nature of politics. We stopped having, in Washington, weekend barbecues between Democrats and Republicans. People used to actually meet the guy who has the office next to them, and they became best friends with the guy for no other reason than his office was next to theirs. And that's what life was like in politics. Kennedy's friends were Republicans, and Biden's friends were Republicans. And this was a life where there wasn't always a constant war. It is today. You can't have a party where you invite both parties to it. You can't get away with it. It won't work. You have to invite a party and invite people that agree with each other in the bubble. The bubble is more powerful than anything in the world is the bubble today.
For reasons that make sense to me, I mean, you had on the prior panel people smarter than I on this, but I've been attracted to those who've explained it by saying we're tribal creatures who crave meaning. We have to have it in our lives, a source of identity, because we see the nature of our existence. We're afraid. And so we seek security and meaning in groups. The potential sources for that meaning have dried up in the United States. The bowling leagues, the churches, the neighborhoods, the associations, the sources of meaning have disappeared on us.
So it's what TV network you watch?
Well, it's what political tribe I'm part of. And so that gives me meaning and identity. And the genius of Donald Trump is he sees that this isn't about policy, this is about meaning and identity. It's about who I am as a person. And once I get you to sign up on that basis, you are not getting away from me, no matter what I do, because to get away is to acknowledge something about yourself that is simply devastating. And so I've got you. And so that's our challenge in this country, and we have to find a way through some of the conversations that were suggested earlier to, in an empathetic way, allow those fraud victims to walk from the courtroom and write a different story that somehow lets themselves out.
Yeah.
It could be I was misunderstood or I had no idea. It doesn't matter what the story is. They have to write a story to escape the fog of lies, and we have to help them do that to get to a healthier place. And this being America will then be on to the next screwed upness, which I can't predict.
Well, there's so much of this about, let me talk about the leader that's behind a good deal of this threat to democracy. It's Donald Trump. And I know him. I found him, he can be very charming, as you know, when you first meet him, and then it gets into a different direction, and he gets very, unpleasant, but he knows how to work people. He has a lot of supporters out there. He works the crowds every night. He's as good as a nightclub comic or a guy with a brick wall behind him. He's a comic, and he knows what works, what people laugh at. He discards terms like Pocahontas when they don't work anymore. He knows which words work and which words don't. He's a very skilled student at our psyche. He's good at it. A lot of Americans feel that the country's unfair. And I don't mean just minorities. I'm talking about people that feel, I didn't get into Harvard. I don't know anybody who goes to Harvard or Yale or Princeton. I don't know any people like that, those people, those elite. I don't go to black tie or white tie dinners. I don't know anything about those people. I see them in movies, I guess, old movies. I don't know who they are. I guess they're the elite. They don't like me. They call me deplorable. I work drive a truck, and I'm trying to make a buck for my family, and I got a section. My wife's got a job. I didn't wish she was working, but she's got a job, and it's rough. And I'm hoping the kid might make it into a community college, or might get to be a plumber's assistant, or going through a program. But they're not in that world. You talked about Pennsylvania, out in those counties, those 60-some counties that are not Philadelphia or Central County or Penn State or not Pittsburgh. They're out there in the country. They didn't go to college, most of them. Trump says, I like the non-educated people. I think he used that phrase one time. I like those people. He's pretty direct about it. They're angry because their own lives haven't looked like they've taken any advantage of life. They've gotten no breaks. And they think, wait a minute, who's this president of Harvard? Who's this president of Penn? Yeah, she's into a lot of trouble. I'm not even sure I disagree with her, but great, she's in trouble. I like that. Trump plays on that. It's the mob at the gate, immigrants, and the rod at the top. He's got the exact formula for raising hell. But the rod at the top, Harvard, MIT, Penn. The mob at the gate on television every night. He's got the mob. Everybody's afraid of the mob. The elite, they can't stand him. He has walked into this scenario from hell that he can play to, right?
Yes, but we're here today. I'm here today to talk about political violence, the lessons of January 6th,
that's what drives it.
And the prospect for this year. I can't say how they'll vote. I'm hopeful they'll vote in a marginal way, in a different way than they have in the past. But I can say with high confidence that they are deterrable against the threat of political violence. That those are people who are not out today robbing banks. They're not blowing up Army recruiting stations. They are people who see the world very differently than I, but they are deterrable. And that's why come back to what the Department of Justice and the FBI have done. That's why that work is so important. That every FBI field office is working every one of these cases. I wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post about this because I was hearing from all kinds of people inside the FBI that there's a lot of our colleagues who don't get why this is so important. And the director wasn't talking about it. And so I wrote basically a letter to the FBI and published it in the Washington Post. I don't know whether anyone else read it. I know it was read inside the FBI. And I said, it's about general deterrence. You have to find every one of these people, misdemeanants or felons, and send that message because you've worked lots of crimes as an FBI agent where deterrence doesn't fit. It's really hard to deter normal violent crime. It's really hard to deter drug trafficking because of the ways in which people commit those crimes. January 6th and its ilk are deterrable because you had to get on a bus, you had to come, you had to stand on the ellipse, then you had to make the decision to walk. And when a line was put up, although an imperfect line by the Capitol Police, you had to push through that. That's an audience that's susceptible of deterrence. And that's why every one of those cases matters, and it can change the nature of the threat. That's why I started by saying deterrence works. We shouldn't allow it to be perversely used against us to say the boogeyman is under the bed. Be careful what you do with this rule of law business. There isn't a boogeyman under the bed. There's a serious threat that we just talked about with the Faucis and others, but there isn't the kind of threat that we saw on our televisions on January the 6th. That's not out there. And the FBI is getting up every day worrying about making sure it's not out there. But those groups are disruptible. Right? The Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, have the worst OPSEC on their communications as you can imagine. One of the FBI's challenges in working those cases is you got to figure out which of our 17 informants are we going to use in this group. This is not the Islamic State. This is not Al-Qaeda. Right? This is not the SDS, the Weathermen. This isn't the Panthers, some of the sophisticated actors of the 60s and 70s. This is a group whose behavior can be shaped by fear. And it's been shaped by fear, and the work has to continue.
You know, I think you make me feel good about the law enforcement piece of what's coming, because I think it looks like that is effective. You've got the tape. Thank God somebody was showing movies of all this. I mean, everybody has done what they've done because we've seen them do it. It isn't really that difficult.
Well, they all had their phones, too, so you could track the location. Cool thing about, say, for example, Google's phones is it actually has a barometric pressures, so they can tell you when you're inside or outside. And so you're able to collect all kinds of data to figure out when someone moved in, when they moved out. Again, this is not
I love to hear the tradecraft.
This is not a sophisticated group of actors. They are susceptible to deterrence. And I was joking with someone, but I said, look, even idiots aren't fools. These people would think twice, 3 times before engaging in that kind of conduct. That's why there's nobody in Lower Manhattan in Foley Square when he's arraigned, some wingnuts with, wearing his garb and trying to sell it. That's why there was no one at the courthouse when he was arraigned. Here in Miami or in Tampa, in West Palm or in Atlanta, because this audience can be shaped by the action of the government.
And people are afraid to be seen.
Yeah, for good reason. If you're going to engage in misconduct, the message of January 6th is, the cool thing about deterrence is, in the mind's eye of those people, the FBI is more powerful than it really is. Good, good. Imagine that there's an agent behind every tree. Imagine that they're tracking you in the supermarket. It's not really healthy for the whole country, but for that audience to see us, I'm no longer us, to see the FBI as the boogeyman is exactly where we want to be.
So let's talk about your former organization, which you're proud to lead. The FBI, there's a new book on A. J. Edgar Hoover, pretty pro-Hoover, right?
It paints an accurate picture of a very complex person.
Yeah.
Bad and good.
Yeah.
The most important lesson, to my mind, of that book is that Hoover was no rogue actor. The power structure in the United States, presidents and senators and congresspersons, all knew what he was doing. All signed up for it. Johnson famously was asked after Kennedy was killed, should we get rid of Hoover? And he said, and quoted in the book, saying, no, I'd rather have him inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. He knew what Hoover was doing. He kept him, and he got special work from the FBI on the '68 Chicago Convention that he shouldn't have gotten. And so, to my mind, that book is a reminder of our tendency to want to blame a person.
Yeah.
No, the problem is us, and that we weren't sufficiently constrained and overseen, and we didn't use our system of government to control ourselves. There were issues with Hoover, but he was a symptom and not a cause.
He also warned Kennedy about Sinatra and the other problems he was involved with.
And I know this from the book. I'm not revealing anything from the FBI.
It's not my book, too. So if you think about the positive nature of the speaker for the Human Rights Campaign, which was so eloquent this morning, and you think about hope, law enforcement is one reason for hope. Evidence gathering is a reason for hope. The use of the telephone, the cell phone, the use of photography, the fact that you can actually catch someone doing it and prove it because you saw it. those rudimentary facts may have saved the day, and they may end up saving the day in the court with the president. Anything else?
Yeah, what this represents. Right? The Kettering Foundation has changed, right? Has stepped out in a way that I don't know the organization, but I'm sure is not entirely uncontroversial and dangerous for a foundation this old, because they see the difference that can be made. I wanted to be part of this when Sharon asked me, because there's no more important
How long did you
work.
wait?
What do you say?
How long did you wait?
I think within 5 minutes. I've known her a long time, but I said, yes, I want to be part of that. What's cool about what's going on in the United States now, especially with young people, is I was worried they were going to withdraw on us and say, it's all okay, boomer, it's all screwed up. The opposite has happened. They are stepping forward and saying, yeah, it's all screwed up. We are going to fix it. And so the idea that an organization as old as this one has decided we are out there, we are going to make a difference, we're going to drive these conversations, that's the control rods being pushed down, and I'm lucky to be a tiny little part of it.
I'm glad to hear that. Also, is Ephraim Zimbalist still carry the day with people, young people today?
No.
He used to be the star of the FBI.
Yeah, and I'll tell you something I did confess that Andy McCabe knows. I summoned is too strong a word. I asked to meet with Dick Wolf, the television producer.
Sure.
I had that guy in my office at FBI 3 times. And I said to him, there need to be programs about the FBI. Every time I turn on the television, I see NCIS. Really? I said, they're awesome people, but there's like 8 of them, right? What about us? What about us? And you know what? He took it to heart. You cannot turn on the television today without seeing attractive, diverse, interesting, intelligent FBI people. That is that organization, and it is exciting that the American people get to see it. It's not Ephraim Zimbalist. I'm sort of the tall, awkward white guy, Ephraim Zimbalist. It's not me. It's something much more interesting, powerful, and better for America than me. I miss it dearly. Andy and I were lucky to be part of it, but I'm glad the American people can see it in that way.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.